It was 12 o'clock in the morning when Bryan was at finishing his so-called sleeping in the dark, aka his demon-slaying job, when he was interrupted by his brother, via telepathy. He was being called to enter the V-realm to take a little break from the human world. Chapter 1. I could use a break from this filthy realm, besides I'm becoming quite bored here. So Bryan accepts his brother's invite and heads home to the portal. Well, here goes. Bryan started as he enters the portal. A few minutes later, Bryan had just regained consciousness and sat up, realizing that he was just outside of a big city. However, he wasn't alone. There were people standing around him looking curious. "What do y'all want?" Bryan asked as he stood up and started walking into the city, thinking something that he hated more than lies and cleaning: school. Chapter 2. I could use a break from this filthy realm, besides I'm becoming quite bored here. So Bryan accepts his brother's invite and heads home to the portal. Well, here goes. Bryan started as he enters the portal. A few minutes later, Bryan had just regained consciousness and sat up, realizing that he was just outside of a big city. However, he wasn't alone. There were people standing around him looking curious. "What do y'all want?" Bryan asked as he stood up and started walking into the city, thinking something that he hated more than lies and cleaning: school. Chapter 3. Now all that's left is to find a job and an apartment, then go shopping for school supplies, I stated in my mind. After completing the tasks I had in mind, I head to my apartment and crash. The next day, I wake up, cook some instant ramen, eat it, pack my lunch, and head to the academy. As I entered the academy, I was stopped by a slightly tall guy who asked me, "Are you Bryan L? If so, I'm Headmaster Mark. Please follow me to my office." So I did as he asked and followed him to his office, and we talked for about 5 minutes. Then he walked me to classroom 2A. This was the music class. "Bryan, please enter this room and try to make some friends and learn music. I will come back when this class is done and take you to the weapon training classes." I nodded and did as he said. I entered the room and introduced myself and sat down, and to my surprise I was quickly learning how to play the keyboard. Bryan. "That's the bell. Everyone remember to study your notes and I'll see you tomorrow," said the music teacher. I got up, and before I could leave I felt a tug on my coat. So I turned my head slightly round and I saw the person tugging my coat, and she looked like she had a couple questions. Chapter 4. "What is it?" I asked the girl who grabbed my shirt. Could you please let me learn a bit about you?" I gave her question some thought and I said, "I suppose so." Upon hearing this, she smiled widely and followed me out of the classroom. Along the way I told her a bit about myself. "Growled." The girl held her stomach while blushing. "Are you hungry?" I asked her, along with offering to buy her lunch. But I didn't know her name, so I asked her what it was. "Miku. Hatsune Miku. That's my name. Also, I'd love it if you bought lunch and ate with me." "It's nice to meet you, Miku. Let's eat in the courtyard," I stated as we walked to the academy's food store. Chapter 5. After buying lunch, Bryan and Miku sit down on the side of a fountain in the courtyard. "Hey Bryan, could you tell me a bit about yourself?" Bryan let set a slight sigh before answering. "I can only tell you what I'm comfortable answering. I'm 17, I'm really good with a rifle, and I draw and color pictures quite well." Miku nods her head while chewing her lunch to show that she's listening and understands. Bryan took a bite of his sandwich and began to finish his food. "I've got to work in the morning to midday, so I will be a little late getting to the academy," Bryan states after he takes the last bite of his sandwich. Chapter 6. The next day Bryan wakes up and heads out to do his job. "Hi boss," Bryan said to the manager as he walked in the store. The manager waved to Bryan as he was counting the cash register's money. A few hours later. "All right, I'm headed to school," Bryan says as he exits the store. As Bryan was walking in front of the school, he saw that Miku was at the gate. "She must have been waiting for me to get here," Bryan thought to himself. So Bryan walked up to her and said, "Hi Miku, were you waiting for me?" Miku flinched and said, "Good God, don't scare me like that." Bryan apologized and offered her to eat with him at a restaurant he found. Miku gladly accepted the offer. "Alright, how about at 3 o'clock in the afternoon?" Chapter 7. "Sure, sounds good," Miku replied. "Cool, see you at the Sacred Dragon restaurant tomorrow," Bryan answered back. After classes in weapon training, Bryan grabbed his messenger bag and started his way out of the academy and headed to his apartment. Bryan let out a long yawn and said, "Man, what a long day it's been." Bryan then cooked his dinner, ate, then he lay down and slept. Chapter 8. The next day, Bryan woke up and did his morning routine, which is walking around town, eating breakfast, and heading to the academy. Before walking into the academy gates, Bryan pulls out his wallet to count his money. Plenty for dinner and some extra things to do. So Bryan puts away his wallet and walks into the gates and starts his day. Chapter 9. After music classes and weapon training classes, Bryan walked out to the gates and waited for Miku. After about 5 minutes, Bryan heard a voice shouting, "Sorry to keep you waiting, Bryan." Bryan noticed that the voice was none other than Miku's. "It's all good, Miku." So the two head out to the Sacred Dragon restaurant for their date. "So Bryan, do you have any siblings?" Miku asks. Bryan stops walking and had a face of sadness and says, "Yeah, I do. His name is Draco." Miku's face had shown a face of surprise. "I know him, he took me and my best friend to a fair a couple of years ago." Bryan snapped out of his sad trance upon hearing those words. Bryan then says, "We're here to change the subject." Chapter 10. "So what do you want to eat, Miku?" Bryan asks her as they were both looking at their menus. "I want to eat sushi and white rice," Miku replied. "What about you?" she asks Bryan. "I want salmon and shrimp," Bryan replied. The waiter walks by and asks them what they were going to buy. They told him and the waiter went to the kitchen and put the orders in place. After waiting about 5 to 10 minutes, the food is ready to be eaten. After eating their food and drinking their drinks, Bryan paid for their stuff. "Do you feel like going to a few areas with me, Miku?" Bryan asks. "Sure, where do you have in mind?" Miku replied. Chapter 11. "A few cliffs with very beautiful views and a photo booth," Bryan replied. So the two head out to the cliffs and get their picture taken. "Thanks for taking me out to have such fun," Miku says to Bryan. "You're welcome." Bryan was interrupted by Miku suddenly hugging him. Bryan slightly blushed and eventually hugged her back.